Obviously, when you're first learning a new language, you're going to be making mistakes, and it can be very frustrating trying to find the mistakes. So let me share a couple of steps that you can take in regards to debugging your code. Debugging is by no means a simple concept to grasp, and unfortunately, it's one that you'll only truly master by making mistakes and actually debugging and probably spending quite a bit of time being frustrated. But I can give you a couple tips on some debugging skills that will help you as you learn PHP and continue to develop it. First of all, coming into coding any sort of language, just know that sometimes the code isn't going to work as you expect it to be. You're going to inevitably create careless errors, and sometimes you're just not going to be able to find those errors very easily. In general, PHP is a pretty user-friendly language, but be prepared to be perplexed and frustrated at times. I've been coding for many years, and occasionally I still get stuck when I'm programming, but debugging is a really important skill to have and one that you'll eventually pick up out of necessity and experience. These are a couple things that you can do, though, to make your life a little bit easier. First of all, always make sure you're running your PHP scripts through a URL. This is probably one of the most common beginner mistakes, that the PHP code has to be run through the web server application, which means it has to be requested through some sort of browser, HTTP, or localhost address. If you open your code by just dragging it to the browser window like you might normally do with HTML, and you can see I'm using the file protocol, then the code is not going to execute. I'm not running the PHP script through the web server application. The next thing that's going to be really important is to know what version of PHP you're actually running. Now remember, if you use the PHP info command, that is one way you can tell. So I'm running version 7.2.1, which is the most current version at this particular time. Some problems may arise because the version that you're using might not be compatible. So make sure that you know that, and before you ever use any sort of PHP enabled server, you should run the PHP info command so that you can confirm the version of PHP that you're using. The next thing that you can do is you can make sure that display errors is turned on. This is a basic PHP configuration setting, and you can confirm the setting is on by, again, executing the PHP info function like I have here. And if we scroll down a little bit and go to the display errors section, which these are going to be alphabetically listed under the core area, you can see that if I look under display errors, it is turned off. Okay, so by default, this is turned off. We want to turn that on. I also like to turn on display startup errors. So both of those settings should be turned on. For security reasons, PHP may not be set to display the errors that occur. And if that's true, when you have an error, the page is not going to render. So for instance, if I come into the page right here, which is showing us our PHP info, and if I deliberately make an error, so I'm just going to get rid of my closing parenthesis and the semicolon, and we refresh the page, this is what happens. The page just doesn't display. It doesn't give me any indication as to why the page isn't displaying. It just doesn't display. So let me show you what happens if we make a change to those two settings that I just mentioned, and how this could potentially at least point you in the right direction. So I'm just going to turn this back on, and obviously you can see that both of these settings are off. So the first thing we need to do is we need to turn those settings on. What you're going to need to do is you're going to need to edit your PHP configuration file. This is going to be located inside of your application. Now, depending on which application server you're using, it may be in a slightly different location. Remember, I'm using MAMP. So for me, I'm going to go into my MAMP setting, and I'm going to go into the bin, I'm going to go into PHP, and if we go into PHP 7.2.1, which remember is the version that I'm using, and I go into the configuration file, there is a file called php.ini. You could also search for this file, but I believe that there's some different versions of that PHP ini file in different, like it's located in each of the versions that you're using. So you're first going to have to find the version that you're using and then find that configuration file. What you're going to do is you're going to open this in your editor. So I'm just going to grab this file, the ini file, and I'm going to open it inside of brackets. So here is the file. This file is going to have a ton of information about how PHP is initialized. So this initialization file is going to be responsible for many of the aspects of PHP's behavior. Now, you need to be careful when you're using this file because you don't want to accidentally do something that might not work. So if you just make any changes and leave the file open, you can always undo and get back, or you might want to even create a copy of it so you had a backup copy. That wouldn't be a bad idea. But if you search down here to around 480, I believe it is, or something in that area, you're going to find the option to change your display errors. And currently the display errors is turned to off. And if you want to read a little bit more about this, you can just go to the text that appears above display errors. So it just lets us know that this directive is going to control whether or not and where PHP is going to output errors, notices, and warnings. Errors are great during development, but they could be dangerous in production environments. So this is a great thing to turn on when you're developing PHP, but when you actually want to push your PHP files live to the server, you probably don't want these on. So this is another reason that I like to develop locally, because I can turn these display errors on and not have to worry about anybody else seeing them, and I won't accidentally forget that I did leave them on or something like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the display errors to on. And you can see that here it tells me the development value on, the default value is on, the production value is off. So these are their recommendations. And then I'm also going to change my display startup errors also to on. So again, this is going to display the errors which occur during PHP's startup sequence, and they're handled separately from display errors. So I like both of those things to be on, so I'm going to go ahead and turn those on. And then I'm going to save my php.ini file. And again, I like to leave this open just in case I made some detrimental error that is going to cause problems. I want to make sure that, I can undo, or I have a backup and I've made a copy. Now, when you make changes, if you're used to developing with HTML and CSS, you would just come to the browser and you would click refresh, and you would see that those changes are going to be initiated. If you look, you can see that the display errors and the display startup errors are still set to off. In PHP, when you make changes to this configuration file, you're going to need to go back to your application server. You're going to need to stop the services. So I'm going to turn off both Apache and MySQL, and then I'm going to turn them back on. And once they turn on, it lets me know that MAMP's been successfully installed. I'm going to back up and go back into my folder directory. So I'm currently working in my O2 directory, and this file is called O4 Debugging PHP. And this is the same exact file, but if we scroll down to that area, you can now see that display errors are turned to on, as well as the display startup errors. So nothing has changed in my file per se, except that these settings have now been switched to on. So if I go back to my debugging file, which I was working from, and once again, I'm just going to get rid of the closing curly brace and the semicolon, I'm going to save. And if we go back to the browser and we refresh, notice the difference. Instead of just not rendering and not showing me the page, it's now giving me some information. So it's letting me know there's a parse error here. There's an unexpected, and then it lets me know that there's a closing PHP tag in application MAMP, HT, it tells me where the file is, and it says on line 13. So this might not make sense to you. You might not understand, like, this is kind of cryptic. It doesn't really tell us what's wrong, but it gives us some really valuable information. We now know what line to kind of look at. So if we go back and we check, here's line 13. So this is where it's saying it's having problems, and that's because this is an incomplete call, so it doesn't really know what to do here. The problem in this case, obviously, we know what it is because I just showed you what I did, but it's going to occur on the line before the closing PHP tag. But this at least kind of points us in the right direction. So hopefully you would be able to discover where your problem is, or at least have a little bit more information in regards to where to look. So that is one thing that you can easily do. And if we save our file and we go back and we refresh, obviously the page is going to load just fine and everything looks great. So I feel like, especially when you're in the development process, you're not in production, turning on those two settings, the display errors and the display startup errors, is probably something that's going to be pretty helpful. The other thing that you can do is, if you have problems, check the HTML source code. So we were looking at that at one of our other files. So here's one of the older files that we were working on, but I used the developer tools and I checked out the HTML source code. So sometimes some PHP error messages can be hidden inside of here. We don't see that happening here, but occasionally it can. Or you might just look and notice that the HTML isn't being rendered in the way that you would expect it to be rendered. So that, again, would hopefully point you in the direction that you might have some problem in the code that you wrote. Another common mistake that beginners make is they don't fully read or trust the error that PHP reports. So I just showed you how it gave me that error message. I might come to my file and just be so committed that there was an issue on line 13 that I might neglect to look around line 13 because maybe the problem is in that general area. So even though the messages often seem like they're kind of cryptic and perhaps meaningless, don't ignore them. There's a problem and you need to look at that error message and try to figure out what's going on and look around the error message. Another really common thing that you can do to help debug is just step away from your code. Take a break. Many times your programming problems are going to be solved just by leaving the computer for a while and going and thinking about something else. When you become really frustrated and confused, then a lot of times you're likely to make other errors, or you're just not going to be able to see your errors. So these are just some general debugging techniques. They're specifically tailored for those people that are beginning to use PHP, and hopefully you'll find them to be helpful, and you'll be able to hopefully identify some issues when you do make mistakes. And just know that you will make mistakes, but learning to resolve them is part of the learning curve and it's part of the process.